Thank you, Rob. Rob, of course, is the father of that extraordinary crossway across the Hudson River, which 3 million people have already visited. So he's a giant in terms of constructing great projects. The Louis Kahn project on Roosevelt Island is really something that you should visit. And because you're here today, I'm going to give free admission to all of you for that. And I'm sorry that I can't join Geraldine in supporting her Eleanor, because I have an Isabel, and I have a Nicholas, and I have a Felix sitting over here tonight. Today, before I came here, they made me pledge to them that I will support them when they run for president. I'm so glad my Roosevelt colleagues are here, Lynn Bassanese, Bob Clark, Felicia Wong, who's the president now of the Franklin Eleanor Roosevelt Institute. There's a wonderful group of people who have made the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor really live again. And Eleanor Roosevelt was an extraordinary woman. On this day of great honor for me, I would like to just recall briefly, if I may, the times and the encounters that I had with her during her life. It began when I was 9 years old, and I read in a local Rochester newspaper that she was coming to town to celebrate I Am an American Day. So I said to my mother, I'm going. I want to meet Mrs. Roosevelt. I got there, I pushed through the crowd, shook her hand, and that was the way I met Eleanor Roosevelt for the first time. Then, when I was 15, by bus and by hitchhiking, I arrived in Hyde Park to mourn the loss of Franklin Roosevelt. And Mrs. Roosevelt made it possible for me to stay when the Secret Service people tried to push me out of the bushes where I was hiding. Then, as a young lawyer in New York, I worked in through the ranks of the Democratic Party reform movement with Jay Gould and others who were regarded as one of our great crusades, which was led by Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a great politician, and Herbert Lehman. And I had the privilege, too, of traveling with her to Chicago to speak for a rally for fair housing. I remember when the chairman of the dinner got to my name, he felt he couldn't pronounce it. So he just went on and said, and so I give you the next speaker. And when Mrs. Roosevelt stood up, she said, Mr. vanden Heuvel, I want you to know that when my husband's ancestors came to this country, they probably couldn't pronounce his name either. But I'm going to help you pronounce yours. And then I had the privilege of escorting, when I ran for Congress in New York in 1960, Senator John Kennedy, and a walk over to Mrs. Roosevelt's apartment where they had breakfast and discussed Kwamoi Matsu and Mrs. Roosevelt's support, which was crucial to his election. The last time I saw her and worked with her was after the Bay of Pigs, that ill-fated thing, when with Robert Kennedy, we worked to have Eleanor Roosevelt as the chairman of the effort that raised the money and negotiated the freedom for the 1,600 prisoners from the Bay of Ribs that were in the Cuban prisons. Eleanor Roosevelt regarded the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as her most important public legacy. She understood that if the United Nations could only be truly effective, if in fact American leadership and ideas were there to support it, she knew it would work. It was the most important, significant chapter of her life. And therefore, in the few minutes given to me, I want to just speak about what the UN meant to her and what she meant to the United Nations. She understood the United Nations to be an instrument of international governance, available to a world that in a nuclear age at last had the possibility of destroying itself. She was aware that the UN reflected the ambitions and the goals and the imperfections of its member states, and today there are 193 of them. She had extensive experience with the John Birch Society, so she would have been able to handle the Tea Party without difficulty. She had fought her entire life against those who used states' rights as a shield for racial injustice and the denial of their constitutional rights. She would stand up and do battle with them, just as we should, and I urge you to do that today. She had ultimate faith in the people, that if they would get involved and would vote and would participate in their community, that the great qualities of America would prevail. In the course of a difficult personal life, she had learned how to cast fear out and to face the unknown. She was a great patriot, very proud of the United States as a new idea in governance, and as an ideal so noble in concept that it would give us confidence in ourselves to really encourage imagination and integrity in public life. In whatever area of involvement, she never faltered in her own courage and conviction. She believed profoundly that human rights were the foundation of liberty and freedom, and she was a relentless warrior to protect the integrity of our political system. We can imagine what she would be saying and doing in this time of stalemated government, where the only agenda of the opposition is to destroy the President of the United States. We can imagine what she would be saying and doing, confronting the decision of Citizens United, where the court, in the most outrageous political decision in our lifetime, reversed a century of precedent to allow corporate funds and unidentified donors to corrupt the political system of our country. The world needs an international structure, she often argued, to maintain peace, to resist aggression, to seek social justice, and she believed the United Nations was the best available international instrument to achieve that purpose. She saw the United Nations as a historical opportunity that would give meaning to the terrible human and material costs of 2 world wars that dominated the 20th century. For us, for Americans, she deeply believed that our nation, with its strength and its wealth and its history, would look upon the UN as a challenge worthy of our effort. Each summer, she would invite representatives of the United Nations to come to Valkill with their families to enjoy a picnic and the informal opportunity of discussion about the problems that plague their nations and the world. I have often suggested that that invitation should be renewed in the name and the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt, to bring those who are the trustees of the United Nations to Valkill on a regular basis, to be reminded by their presence here and of her memory of what hopes and commitments they are obligated to pursue. I renew that suggestion today. Let the ambassadors of the United Nations and their families come to this place. Let them reflect on the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt and understand the simplicity of her life and the depth of her ideals. When President Truman appointed Eleanor Roosevelt as a member of the first delegation to the United Nations in December 1945, she was the only woman participant in that group that was sent to the United Nations. Her male colleagues, which included John Foster Dulles and Arthur Vandenberg and others, all scoffed at her appointment and were prepared to discount her role and her influence. She quickly showed them how mistaken they were. In the opening debates of the General Assembly, she confronted Andrei Vyshinsky, the notorious Soviet prosecutor of the trials of the 1930s, regarding the care and the feeding of 60 million European displaced persons. Eleanor Roosevelt understood the political and the humane issues involved, and she refuted the Soviet demand for repatriation. Her debates with the Soviets were presented with grace and with intelligence and with respect, and there was no question who prevailed. Chosen as chairman of the Human Rights Commission, she worked for 3 years to create an international Bill of Rights. It required monumental effort. She would chair more than 3,000 hours of contentious debate to define human rights. It was a brilliant opportunity to show her political skill, to show her energy, to show her commitment and her stamina, and the incomparable capacity to find principled compromise among the nations of the world. She fought the Soviets and she fought the State Department, and no one other than Eleanor Roosevelt could have negotiated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which on December 10th, 1948, in the meeting of the General Assembly in Paris, was adopted unanimously by the nations of the world and remains today the greatest signal monument to the human rights struggle. The Declaration was adopted without a negative vote, and the representatives of the world stood and gave Eleanor Roosevelt a prolonged ovation, and December 10th became the serious and signal date in civil rights history. The United Nations is an instrument we created to help build a better world. In the last 10 years of her life, no longer in government, no longer with an official title, Eleanor Roosevelt worked every day as a volunteer in the United Nations Association to bring the message of international cooperation to her country and to the world. And on this occasion, and on every occasion where Eleanor Roosevelt is honored, let us renew our commitment to the United Nations and the opportunity it gives us to stop war, to advance social justice, and to build a better world. It would be the greatest tribute we could offer to the woman who was known as the First Lady of the world and who in our memory still is, Eleanor Roosevelt. Thank you.